Long before America had a name, it already had a history, not a short one, not a simple one, but a deep, layered past stretching back tens of thousands of years. When we think of America's history, the story often begins with ships crossing the Atlantic. But that moment was not a beginning. It was an interruption. The land already knew humanity long before Europeans ever imagined it. During the last ice age, when massive glaciers locked much of the planet's water into ice, the world looked very different. Sea levels were lower, continents were closer, and between what we now call Asia and North America, a vast land bridge emerged, a cold, open corridor of grass and tundra. Across this bridge, humans moved, not in a single wave, not in one moment, but gradually, over generations. These were not explorers chasing glory. They were families following food, animals, and seasons. Step by step, they entered a continent untouched by human hands, and once they arrived, they stayed. Over thousands of years, people spread southward. They crossed mountains, forests, plains, and deserts. They adapted to extreme cold and intense heat. They learned the rhythms of unfamiliar animals and plants. Slowly, patiently, they made the land their home. By the time the Ice Age ended and the land bridge vanished beneath rising seas, America was no longer empty. It was already human. These early Americans were not wandering aimlessly. They observed the stars. They followed migration routes. They understood fire, stone, water, and seasons. Knowledge was passed through stories, tools, and memory. Over time, distinct cultures emerged. Languages diversified. Beliefs took shape. Trade routes formed. The land itself shaped the people, and the people shaped the land. Forests were managed. Plains were burned to encourage new growth. Rivers became highways of movement and exchange. Long before cities of stone rose elsewhere in the world, America already held networks of human life stretching across vast distances. What matters most is this: America was not discovered. It was inhabited, understood, lived in. By the time the rest of the world took notice, the continent already carried generations of stories beneath its soil. This chapter of history is often treated as a preface, something brief, distant, and abstract. But it is the foundation of everything that follows. Because once people belong to a land for long enough, they don't just live on it. They become part of it. The first Americans did not arrive to conquer a wilderness. They arrived to learn it. For thousands of years, human groups spread across the continent, adapting to environments unlike anything their ancestors had known. From frozen northern tundra to dense forests, from open plains to dry deserts, survival required observation, memory, and cooperation. These early societies were not primitive in the way they are often imagined. They were complex in a different way. They understood animal behavior with precision. They knew when herds would move, where fish would spawn, and which plants could heal or harm. Seasons were not dates on a calendar. They were lived experiences, reading the sky, the soil, and the wind. Over time, people stopped merely following nature and began shaping it. Controlled fire was used to clear land, guide animals, and encourage new plant growth. This was not accidental. It was intentional land management. Forests were thinned. Plains were renewed. Entire ecosystems were influenced by human decision-making long before modern agriculture. As populations grew, cultures diversified, different regions produced different ways of life. Along rivers and coasts, fishing communities thrived. In fertile valleys, farming slowly developed. In harsher landscapes, mobility and trade became essential. No single culture defined early America. It was a mosaic of societies connected by movement and exchange. Trade networks stretched across vast distances. Stone, shells, copper, obsidian, and pigments traveled hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles. These were not isolated groups. They communicated. They exchanged goods, ideas, and beliefs. America was already interconnected long before roads or written maps existed. Spiritual life was deeply woven into daily existence. The land was not owned. It was related to. Mountains, rivers, animals, and skies were not resources. They were participants in the world. Stories explained origins, responsibilities, and limits. Knowledge was preserved through oral tradition, ritual, and repetition, passed carefully from one generation to the next. This way of life endured for millennia. By the time large cities rose in other parts of the world, the Americas already supported millions of people living in stable, sustainable systems. These societies were not frozen in time. They evolved, adapted, and responded to environmental change. What they did not do was leave behind stone monuments everywhere or written records meant to last forever. Their history lived in memory, not marble, and that made it fragile. Because when a culture's knowledge exists in people rather than books, its survival depends on continuity. Break the chain, and entire worlds of understanding can vanish. This is the tragedy at the heart of early American history. Not that these societies lacked sophistication, but that much of their sophistication was never meant to survive interruption. When disruption finally came, it would not just change the future of America. It would silence much of its past. When people imagine ancient America, they often picture scattered villages and small communities living close to nature. That image is incomplete. Long before Europeans arrived, the Americas were home to large organized societies, some of them complex enough to rival the great civilizations of the Old World. These were not empty lands waiting to be claimed. They were shaped by centuries of human planning, belief, and labor. Across North America, cities rose and fell. Some were built of stone, others of earth and wood. Many were designed to last only as long as they were needed. But at their height, they were alive with people, trade, ceremony, and power. One of the largest cities in the ancient world once stood near the Mississippi River. Today, it is known as Cahokia. At its peak, it was larger than London was at the same time. Massive earthen mounds dominated the landscape. Plazas hosted gatherings of thousands. Trade networks connected the city to regions hundreds of miles away. Cahokia was not an exception. Across the continent, societies engineered their environments. Canals redirected water. Terraces reshaped hillsides. Roads connected distant settlements. Agricultural systems supported dense populations long before modern tools existed. Further south, in what is now Mexico and Central America, complex civilizations flourished for centuries. They built cities aligned with the stars, developed calendars of astonishing accuracy, recorded history, astronomy, and mathematics in symbols and stone. These cultures understood time not as a straight line, but as cycles, repeating patterns of creation, destruction, and renewal. Power in these societies did not always look like modern government. Authority could come from ritual knowledge, ancestry, or spiritual responsibility. Leaders were expected not just to rule, but to maintain balance between people, land, and the unseen world. What connected these civilizations was not uniformity, but sophistication. They planned cities, managed food production, maintained trade routes, educated specialists, and passed down knowledge through generations. They were not isolated. Ideas moved, styles spread, beliefs evolved. America was part of a wider human story developing along its own path. Then, abruptly, many of these civilizations declined. Some faded slowly, others collapsed rapidly. Droughts, environmental stress, internal conflict, and shifting trade all played roles. But decline did not mean disappearance. People moved, cultures adapted, knowledge was carried forward in new forms. When Europeans eventually arrived, they did not encounter a pristine wilderness. They encountered the aftermath of civilizations that had already risen, transformed the land, and changed the course of history. The tragedy is not that these civilizations failed. It is that their achievements were largely ignored. Because when history is written by newcomers, what came before is often treated as absence rather than presence. And that misunderstanding would shape everything that followed. Chapter 4. The Arrival That Changed Everything. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they did not step into an empty world. They stepped into one they did not understand. For generations, this moment has been described as a discovery. But discovery suggests absence. What actually occurred was a collision between worlds that had evolved separately for thousands of years. The first encounters were not immediately violent. Curiosity moved both ways. Trade began. Objects were exchanged. Ideas were tested. But beneath the surface, an imbalance already existed. It was not technology that changed everything first. It was disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other illnesses traveled faster than soldiers or settlers ever could. Indigenous populations had no immunity to these diseases. Entire communities collapsed before they ever saw a European face. In some regions, more than half the population died within decades. This was not conquest by battle. It was devastation by biology. As populations declined, social structures weakened. Knowledge holders died. Trade networks fractured. Sacred sites were abandoned. What Europeans encountered was often not a civilization at its height, but one already reeling from invisible catastrophe. This created a dangerous illusion. Settlers saw reduced populations and assumed the land had always been sparsely inhabited. They mistook survival for simplicity. They mistook loss for absence. With this misunderstanding came justification. Land was claimed under the belief that it was unused. Treaties were signed with societies already destabilized. Agreements were broken when they became inconvenient. Expansion followed confusion, and confusion hardened into policy. At the same time, European powers brought with them entirely different ideas about land, ownership, and authority. In many indigenous societies, land could not be owned, only cared for. In Europe, land was property. It could be bought, sold, fenced, and defended. These two worldviews could not easily coexist. Religion added another layer of disruption. Spiritual systems that had developed over millennia were dismissed as superstition. Conversion was often framed as salvation, but enforced through pressure, violence, or cultural erasure. Sacred objects were destroyed. Languages were suppressed. Memory itself became a battleground. None of this happened all at once. It unfolded unevenly over centuries across vast distances. Some regions experienced brutal conquest. Others endured slow displacement. But the pattern was consistent. Power shifted, and the people who had shaped the land for generations were pushed to its margins. By the time European colonies became permanent, the Americas were already transformed, not just physically, but historically. What followed would be recorded in books, maps, and laws. What came before would be reduced to fragments, often misunderstood, often ignored. This was the turning point, not because new people arrived, but because an older world was no longer allowed to continue on its own terms. Once European powers decided the Americas were here to stay, the purpose of the land changed. It was no longer a place to encounter. It became a place to extract. Colonies were not built to create new societies. They were built to serve distant empires. Land, labor, and resources were organized around one central goal: profit. Forests were cut for timber. Fields were reshaped for cash crops. Rivers became trade routes moving goods outward, not communities inward. The land was measured, divided, and claimed in ways that would have been unrecognizable to those who had lived on it for generations. To make this system work, control was essential. Indigenous nations were pushed aside through treaties that favored colonizers, agreements made under pressure, or outright force. When resistance appeared, it was met with military response. When cooperation was demanded, it was enforced through dependency. But land alone was not enough. Colonial economies required labor on a massive scale. In some regions, indigenous people were forced into labor systems that drained communities already weakened by disease. When these populations declined further, European powers turned to a brutal alternative: enslaved Africans. Millions were taken from their homes, transported across the Atlantic, and forced into lifelong bondage. Their labor built plantations, ports, roads, and cities. Entire colonial economies depended on their suffering. Slavery was not a side effect of colonization, it was a foundation. These systems created rigid hierarchies. At the top were colonial elites and administrators. Beneath them were settlers with limited power but growing opportunity. Below that were enslaved people and displaced indigenous nations, denied rights, autonomy, and recognition. Law reinforced this structure. Colonial governments passed rules that defined who could own land, who could testify in court, who could move freely, and who could not. Race became a tool of governance. Identity was codified not to understand people, but to control them. At the same time, colonies began to develop identities of their own. Distance from Europe created tension. Settlers who benefited from the system resented external control over trade and taxation.
Push it up now!
They wanted autonomy, not for everyone, but for themselves.
Hold the beam steady.
This contradiction sat at the heart of colonial America. Freedom was demanded loudly, but applied selectively. The same system that spoke of liberty relied on forced labor. The same leaders who resisted imperial authority expanded westward into indigenous land. Extraction continued, only now power was shifting locally. By the mid-17th century, the colonies were no longer just outposts. They were societies built on layered inequality, economic dependence, and competing ideas of freedom. What came next would not erase these contradictions. It would formalize them, and in doing so, it would give birth to a new nation, one that inherited both the ambitions and the injustices of the colonial world that created it. When the American colonies declared independence in 1776, it was framed as a birth, a new nation, a new beginning, a break from the
All right,
past.
men, lift together now.
But independence did not create a new world. It rearranged an old one. The revolution was not fought to overturn the systems that governed land, labor, or power. It was fought to decide who controlled them. Authority shifted from a distant empire to a local elite, but the foundations beneath that authority remained largely intact. The language of the revolution spoke of freedom, equality, and natural rights. These ideas were powerful. They inspired resistance, sacrifice, and unity.
Watch the current on
But
the
they
left.
were also selective.
Pull harder on your
Freedom was
side.
expanded,
Side.
but not universally.
Pull harder on the right
Enslaved
side.
people remained enslaved. Indigenous nations were excluded entirely. Women were denied political voice. Property ownership continued to determine who mattered in the new republic. Independence did not dismantle hierarchy. It nationalized it. The new government quickly moved to formalize control. A constitution was written to stabilize power, protect property, and prevent chaos. It balanced ideals with compromise, and those compromises embedded inequality into the structure of the nation itself. Slavery was not abolished. Indigenous sovereignty was ignored. Expansion was assumed. The land hunger that defined the colonial era did not slow down. It accelerated. Westward movement became a national mission. Territory was framed as destiny. New lands meant new wealth, new states, and new influence. What stood in the way were existing nations that had lived on that land for generations. Treaties were signed, then broken, then rewritten. Removal became policy. Displacement was justified as progress. Entire peoples were pushed off ancestral lands to make room for farms, towns, and railroads. Independence gave the state the power to act, and it used that power decisively. At the same time, the economy transformed. Industry expanded. Trade increased. Cities grew. The United States positioned itself not just as a former colony, but as a rising power. Yet the labor that fueled this growth remained deeply unequal. Enslavement continued in the South. Exploitation expanded in the North. Opportunity was unevenly distributed. The contradiction between ideals and reality widened. America spoke of liberty while denying it to millions. It celebrated self-rule while enforcing domination. It promised a future while erasing parts of its past. Independence did not resolve these tensions. It set the stage for them. The nation that emerged was ambitious, energetic, and confident, but also fractured. Its greatest strengths were tied to its deepest conflicts. To understand what America became, it is not enough to look at its founding words. You have to look at who those words left out. Because the story of America after independence is not about beginnings. It is about consequences. As the United States moved into the 19th century, its direction was clear. Outward, expansion was no longer a possibility. It was a principle. The nation believed its future lay in growth. Across rivers, plains, mountains, and deserts, land promised wealth, security, and power. And so the country pushed west. This expansion was framed as opportunity. Farms for settlers, towns for families, resources for industry. The idea of progress became inseparable from movement. To stop expanding was to fall behind. But expansion always has a cost. For indigenous nations, it meant removal. Federal policy shifted from negotiation to force. Treaties were signed under pressure, rewritten, or ignored altogether. When resistance remained, it was answered with military campaigns. Communities were uprooted, sacred lands were seized, entire nations were marched away from their homelands. The Trail of Tears was not an exception. It was a warning. Removal became law. Displacement became routine. Survival depended on compliance with a system designed to erase autonomy. The land was open to settlers, and the violence that made this possible was quickly forgotten or justified as necessity. At the same time, the nation grew economically. Railroads cut across the continent. Mines extracted coal, silver, and gold. Factories multiplied in expanding cities. Immigration surged as people from Europe and Asia arrived seeking work, safety, or land of their own. America became a place of opportunity and exploitation. Industrial growth created wealth on an unprecedented scale, but it also produced harsh labor conditions, extreme inequality, and environmental damage. Workers toiled long hours for little pay. Children labored in factories. Accidents were common. Protection was rare. The country grew stronger, faster, and richer. It also grew more divided. Nowhere was this division clearer than in the question of slavery. As new states entered the Union, the balance between free and enslaved labor became increasingly unstable. Expansion forced the nation to confront a contradiction it had postponed since independence. Could a country built on freedom continue to rely on bondage? The answer came through conflict. The Civil War was not simply a battle over territory or politics. It was the result of decades of unresolved tension between growth and justice, profit and principle. When the war ended, slavery was abolished, but the deeper structures of inequality remained. Reconstruction promised change. It delivered resistance. Legal freedom did not guarantee safety, equality, or power. New systems emerged to replace the old. Segregation hardened. Violence enforced social order. Progress advanced unevenly, often at the expense of those it claimed to include. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had transformed itself. It was larger, more powerful, more industrialized, but it carried forward every unresolved question it had inherited. Expansion had built a nation. It had also left a trail of displacement, conflict, and unfinished justice. Consequences that would shape America long after the frontier closed. America is often described as an idea, a promise, a dream, a beginning. But history shows something more complicated. America is not a single story moving in a straight line. It is layers of stories built on top of one another. Some preserved, some altered, some deliberately forgotten. Long before the nation existed, the land already carried meaning. People lived here, adapted here, shaped ecosystems, built cities, and passed down knowledge through generations. That world did not vanish on its own. It was interrupted, displaced, and overwritten. Colonization did not erase the past, it covered it. Independence did not reset history, it redirected power. Expansion did not simply grow a country, it concentrated opportunity while spreading loss. At every stage, America was defined not just by what it created, but by what it chose to ignore. This does not make the American story unique in its flaws. It makes it human. Nations are built through ambition, conflict, compromise, and consequence. What matters is not whether a country's history is perfect, but whether it is understood honestly. Because when parts of history are left out, they don't disappear. They resurface in inequality, in tension, in unresolved questions about identity and belonging. America today carries all of this within it. It is young as a nation, but ancient as a land. It speaks the language of freedom, while still reckoning with who that freedom applies to. It celebrates progress, while standing on foundations shaped by struggle. To understand America is not to choose pride or criticism. It is to recognize complexity. The past does not demand guilt. it demands awareness. Because the future of any nation is shaped not by the myths it tells about itself, but by the truths it is willing to face. America did not begin at one moment. It did not belong to one people. And it cannot be understood through one lens. It is a living history, still unfolding